So we are back for another session with the book of Deuteronomy, and a housekeeping item first. On Monday evening, December 11th, we will be having a panel discussion with myself, someone from the Reformed Church, and someone from the Catholic Church, just kind of talking in broad terms about what each branch of the church believes about some kind of big picture items. We are doing that expressly for our confirmation students, but certainly the invitation is out there to anybody who'd like to be part of it. So please join us Monday evening, December 11th at 6:30 for that panel discussion. So we are continuing with the same handout we have used for at least a week. Before we go ahead and jump in here, is there anything still kind of hanging out from the last time we were together on this that is in need of any further discussion or clarification? Okay. So we kind of wrapped up last time talking about the Ten Commandments, and there were some slight differences in the commandment about Sabbath between this and the Exodus account, but by and large, they were very similar. So we're going to continue, and we're going to do a little bit of just kind of sampling of the type of material that is in Deuteronomy. So we will go through and identify some of that. So we are going to start. We've just finished the Ten Commandments. Um, we're going to jump to chapter 6. Tom, would you share with us, please, chapter 6, verses 1 through 9?
Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord your God charged me to teach you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy, so that you and your children's children may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life, and keep all his decrees and his commandments that I am commanding you, so that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe them diligently, so that it may go well with you, and so that you may multiply greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. I don't know if we're losing them again or not.
Is anyone else having trouble hearing? All right. So can everybody hear me okay?
Now we can.
Now we can.
We're able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Tom.
So we just had the Ten Commandments, and now we have this commandment. And it's kind of interesting. Scripture itself says this is the greatest commandment. When they ask Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? This is what he says: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And I just think it's interesting that so often we place a lot of Jesus, who as Christians Christians we believe is the ultimate interpreter of Scripture, didn't even choose one of the Ten Commandments when people flat. So I just find that kind of fascinating, um, that is the case. Carol, can I have you jump in with Deuteronomy 7, verses 7 through 11?
It was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his heart on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all the peoples. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors that the
Is
Lord
anybody
has
hearing
brought.
me? Oh, good,
Yes.
good, good, good.
Are you hearing me?
It's coming and going.
I can hear you clearly, Carol.
Good.
Okay. I was up to, let's see, verse 8. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who maintains covenant loyalty with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and who repays in their own person those who reject him. He does not delay, but repays in their own person those who reject him. Therefore, observe diligently the commandment, the statutes and the ordinances that I am commanding you today.
So we have touched on this in previous sessions here on while to look at it again, and that is that Deuteronomy articulates the idea of election. Israel is God's people solely for the reason God says so. If any of us were in God's place and said, I want to partner with a group of people so that the world will know who I am, my guess is we probably would have picked Egypt. Um, Egypt is the biggest, Egypt is the strongest. They can spread the news pretty easily. And yet, God chose. I think that idea of election can take on a different sense of meaning for us in the church today. And as I've said before, I think maybe part of it is the idea that we become God's people through baptism. So, in that sense, the church, as everyone who is baptized, is the elect, chosen by God's grace for a particular mission or a particular calling. Not necessarily, that you're going to get all the good stuff all the time, but that God loves the world, but God chooses a people out of the world, and those people are kind of set apart for a higher calling or a greater responsibility. And I think maybe that can be more helpful to us than what the church has worked with for so long, which is kind of the idea of we're the biggest institution around and we kind of get to dictate to other people. And that's not the case anymore. So maybe the idea of election as being chosen for a particular mission could be more helpful in how we understand who we are and what we are called to do. Um, what do people think about that conjecture?
Makes sense.
Okay, I love. Let's keep rolling along. as I keep rolling along, we may be done a little bit early, and I will be going directly to bed. So, um, Nick, will you share with us, please, Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 through 22?
So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today for your own well-being. Although heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth with all that is in it, yet the Lord set his heart in love on your ancestors alone and chose you, their descendants after them, out of all the people as it is today. Circumcise then the foreskin of your heart, and do not be stubborn any longer. For the Lord of your God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphans and the widow, and who loves strangers and providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, him alone you shall worship, to him you shall hold fast, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and awesome things, and your own eyes have seen. Your ancestors went down to Egypt 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you numerous as the stars of heaven.
So, we have here one of the many, many, many places in Hebrew scripture where we talk about God as the one who executes justice for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Um, what is the basis of that? I mean, I know at a certain level it matters, that God says so, but why is it so important to God that His people act in this way towards the widow, the orphan, the alien, the stranger? What is the connection between what God has done and what God calls His people to do?
It's one and the same. That's the way
Say more.
that's the way he treated them. I mean, it just hit me now. He's right. Right. They went to Egypt, only 70 people. And out of that, what, 1,000,000, 400 years later, exited? They were the downcast. They were the least among all the residents in Egypt.
Right.
And he made them a great people.
Yeah, and God delivered them from slavery. So, yeah, Mark, it's exactly what you said. It is both their gracious response to God as well as they are called to imitate God's mercy. Um, there's places we saw it a lot in Leviticus. Be holy, therefore, as God is holy. Here the message is be merciful as God is merciful. Um, so again, it's this is how God has treated them. They were the strangers in the land of Egypt, and God acted toward them with mercy. Therefore, you will treat the least among you with mercy. So again, the relationship between God and His people ideally is the model for the relationship between God's people and one another.
Isn't that also saying love your neighbor?
It is, but in this case, it is is giving some of the background for it, and it is lifting up particular neighbors, among whom God really expects you to show love and have mercy. So yes, you need, excuse me, you need to love all your neighbors, and you cannot forget that these people who probably can't do anything to love you back, so to speak, um, these people need your care and concern too. So again, it's a question that keeps coming up. Who is my neighbor? People ask Jesus. Who is my neighbor? Um, as he says, the greatest commandment: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the lawyer asks him, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So, um, yes, it is definitely love your neighbor, but I think it shines a particular spotlight on the neighbors who are most in need.
Yeah, I think the orphan and widow, I mean, it also plays into the recent gospel readings from Matthew with the least, that um you you what did you do for the least of did you just did I'm trying to remember the 2 weeks ago um
What you did for the
gospel
least
reading in
of,
terms of the least of that's in terms of when did I not do something for you, Jesus, when you
right,
didn't do it for the least.
exactly, yeah. When did I see you hungry or sick or naked and not care for you? Jesus says, just as you didn't do it to the least of these who are my people, you didn't do it to me either. Exactly. So some book I have somewhere probably has a count of how many times God talks about the importance of caring for the widow, the orphan, and the alien. I've not come across it, but I guarantee it's a lot. So God's mercy is to be the model for how God's people conduct themselves with one another. Um, other thoughts? Mark, can you share with us, please, Deuteronomy 11, verses 26 through 28?
See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God. Return from the way that I am commanding you today to follow other gods that you have not known.
So, we talked a little bit in previous classes about this idea that Deuteronomy has its own theology. It has its own distinct teaching about who God is and how God works. And these three verses here are a very concise summary of what Deuteronomy has to say about God. Um, what how would we sum that up? What is Deuteronomy's teaching about how God works?
If you obey the Lord, good things will happen to you. If you disobey the Lord, you'll be banished. Might this be written after 722, after the northern kingdom has already fallen?
Right. So, you are definitely on the right track there, with that, Nick. So yes, Deuteronomy is very much about honor God's commandments and have prosperity, dishonor God's commandments, and wait for the calamity. Um, so yeah, I think one of the things that is so fascinating about Deuteronomy is the way I think most of the time it reads equally well. Like it preaches God's word, um, equally equally faithfully, Um, it shares an important message, and that message is important both to the people who are hearing it as Moses preaches it. So the people who are coming out of the Exodus and about to enter the land, this serves as a warning. See, I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. Honor my commandments and you can stay in this land. It's going to be good. Forget about me and worship other gods. Bad things are going to happen. So the tradition that was received of Moses preaching this sermon, it sounds like guidance. It sounds like a word of caution to the people. But as that tradition that has been received is then written down and kind of shaped into the book that we have, that happens probably after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, and very likely in the form we have it now after the fall of Judah. So, what does it sound like if we are people in Babylon, or we are people returning from Babylon to the promised land? How does this strike us?
We deserve what we got.
Yeah, it's a theological interpretation of history. How come we don't still have that promised land? God promised to give us that land, and here we are in Babylon. Yeah, God gave you the land, and God said, you need to honor my commandments to live in this land. Um, so yeah, again, the way that Deuteronomy speaks both to the people about to enter the land as well as to the people who have been taken from the land generations later. I think that's a really profound thing about Deuteronomy. So, chapters 12 through 26, that's a lot of the guts of, remember, we're looking at Deuteronomy like a treaty between God and humanity. Chapters 12 through 26 have a lot of the guts of the treaty. These are the provisions, the actual um, guidance that the people are supposed to be following. Um, and it can seem a little bit kind of like it's just a long list and it's kind of as Moses thinks of it or as God reveals it, it just kind of is there. Um, but there are scholars that propose that at least chapters 12 through 16, there's a core of teaching in there that is kind of arranged so that it takes on the pattern of the Ten Commandments. So we have those Ten Commandments in chapter 5, and then chapters 12 through at least 16 seem to be following that same order in terms of the content. And again, that is a proposal, and we can go through and see if we feel like that holds water. So, Jennifer, can I have you read Deuteronomy 12, 13, and 14, and then I will read Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11.
Okay. You are not to offer your sacrifices wherever you choose. You must offer them only in the one place that the Lord will choose in the territory of one of your tribes. Only there are you to offer your sacrifices that are to be burned and do all the other things I
So,
have come.
so we have, very specific instructions on how we are supposed to worship God. You don't get to choose anywhere else that you um, might want to worship in particular ways. And in chapter 13, we have the following: if anyone secretly entices you, even if it is your brother, your father's son, or your mother's son, or your own son or daughter, or the wife you embrace, or the most intimate friend, saying, let us go worship other gods, whom neither you nor your ancestors have known, any of the gods of the peoples that are around you, whether near you or far away from you, from one end of the earth to the other. You must not yield or heed to such persons. Show them no pity or compassion, and do not shield them. But you shall surely kill them with your own hand, to be the first against them to execute them, and afterward the hand of all the people. Stone them to death for trying to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then all Israel shall hear and be afraid, and never again do any such wickedness. So, thematically, which of the 10 Commandments does this seem to kind of line up with?
The first one,
Which would be,
love the Lord your God with all your heart, might, and
right?
soul.
Yep. And as we look at the 10 Commandments, no other gods. If there is nothing else we learn from our Hebrew Bible, and there is certainly much more I hope we learn, but if you learn nothing else, no other gods. Idolatry is a big problem. So yeah, you can kind of see chapters 12 and 13 kind of follow that notion of uh, unconditional loyalty to the God who delivered the people from Egypt. Tom, would you share with us, please, Deuteronomy 14, 1 through 3?
You are children of the Lord your God. You must not lacerate yourselves or shave your forelocks for the dead. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. It is you the Lord has chosen out of all the peoples of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. You shall not eat any abhorrent things.
And then there is a list that specifies what those abhorrent things might be. So, this idea of you as God's people need to um, there's this thought of purity or holiness. Um, do we feel like that might line up with one of the commandments? Well, there are certain practices that we should not do because they dishonor God. Which of the commandments lists something that we are not supposed to do to God?
You use the God's name improperly.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's a parallel here. Um, we are supposed to honor God's name. We are not supposed to use it in particular ways. We are not supposed to uh, treat our bodies in certain ways. That that idea of purity or holiness, and it's not that the idea of purity has to do with um, what is a proper state for approaching God in worship. So I see a parallel there. It's maybe not as strong as the first one, but bear with me. Um, Shirley, would you share with us, please, those selected verses from Deuteronomy 15?
I'll have, I'll have to do that.
Okay, we'll throw it back to you again, Tom.
Okay, 15, 1 through 2.
Yes.
Every seventh year you shall grant a remission of debts. And this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed.
And then jump down to 12 through 15, if you would, please.
Oh, okay. If a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you 6 years, in the seventh year you shall set that person free. And when you send a male slave out from you, a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Provide liberally out of your flock your threshing flour and your winepress, thus giving to him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today.
So, which of the Ten Commandments do we see a parallel with here?
The Sabbath, the seventh, whatever it is.
Right, yes, seventh day or seventh year, and that idea of a time of rest or renewal, a rest from debt, a rest from slavery, um, and that notion, and that this maybe was not something that the people that Moses had in mind, or that the people who wrote Deuteronomy had in mind, but um, to think about that the kingdom of God, or maybe something that's a little more Jewish in character, the age to come. Sabbath is supposed to be like a preview of that. It's like a little piece of God's kingdom that's dropped into ordinary time. Um, that time of rest, that time of simply being able to enjoy the goodness of God's creation. It's kind of applied to debt or even to slavery here. So that idea of honoring the Sabbath, it's not just about every seventh day you break from what you're doing to honor God, but it also has to do with rest for the weary. Questions, comments, concerns, insights?
Question about the issue of slavery. So the people had slaves amongst themselves.
Yeah. Kind of interesting that God has just delivered the people from slavery, and there are provisions here of how they themselves are supposed to act toward their slaves. Um, yeah, that's hard.
Mhm.
I think part of part of what's going on is that in the ancient world, slavery was simply so pervasive and such an everyday fact of life. It was just kind of understood as, it's always going to be there. It's going to be a uh, part of how life is. Um, and yeah, that is difficult to deal with. I think it's extra difficult as Americans, in that part of the story of our country is um, a war, you know, about slavery. Sorry to disappoint if anybody's watching and says the Civil War is about something else. Um, the state's right that the war was about was the right to hold people as slaves, and so yeah, it's challenging.
Could it be that it was so it was accepted because there were no other alternatives, like we have social programs. So if you're not working or you're not doing something, you can, you still have options in a modern society. Well,
Hmm.
then they didn't really have that. So, you know, or conquered peoples. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I try to imagine what it was like back then. If you didn't work or do something, or didn't have the means, you had to work for somebody. you know, and maybe that's more what it was like. But if, you know, it's not like the slavery that we had in North America, well, in the Americas, because here, you know, those were their whole lives. You know, they were
Right.
slaves their whole lives, and their children were slaves, and it just continued. But here,
Yeah, and
it's every 6 years. You know,
yeah, and in the ancient world, it was not primarily, um, it was not racially based, but it's exactly like you said. It was people who lost a war. It was people who had to sell themselves to pay off a debt. Um, People would sell family members into slavery. Um, and to an extent, the like in the Roman world, there were slaves who were very highly educated, highly skilled people, and they would be in charge of people's whole estates, and yet they still had no rights to own anything themselves. So it it's different than what I think we're more think about when we think about the United States context, but it's still people who don't have any right to even own themselves. Um, but yeah,
But
it's hard to square.
I think here though the fact that the commandment is you know, after 6 years of good labor, they're to go free, and I don't think that was necessarily the case everywhere. So that was a bit
Mhm.
of a um you know unusual behavior, I guess, or unusual social contract that was deemed required for the Jewish people, that probably, you know, that was not a common practice, I'm assuming, in that time frame.
Right. Yeah. Um, this was an improvement, I would think.
Sure. It basically is a path to improve one's lot in life by
Mhm.
quote unquote being a good slave.
and they didn't
So,
get sent away empty-handed. That's the part that resonated with me.
right.
Right.
You're going to set this person up with what they need to, kind of get their feet on the ground.
How did they keep track of years?
Hmm. Um,
Change the
that's a
moon. Every new moon, they counted a month.
right. Yeah. So the Hebrew calendar was kind of partially lunar, partially solar. Um, but in terms of, how did they, I think, Mark, what you're wondering is, we count our years from what we think was the birth of Jesus. In Rome, they counted years from the foundation of Rome. I'm not sure how they reckoned years in ancient Israel. I know we get a lot in the historical books about in the fifth year of King David. And then later we get, in the first year of whoever was king in Judah, which was the eighth year of whoever was king in Israel. But yeah, I'm not sure. Not sure if there was a
Calendar.
standard way of reckoning the time.
Right. But in terms of the amount of time, like the duration for these 6 years, I mean, I think that just following the solar progression of the sun, and they were able to know when a year passed. I
Right.
think that was easily done. And
Right.
what they used to demark that, I mean, they didn't have calendars on their phone, obviously, but they must have had some way of checking things off, to say that, another month has passed and the year has passed.
Right.
Well,
So
is it the seventh year? Was it the same for everybody? Because I could see I could see somebody going, hey, I've been working for you for 6 years. Nah, it's been more like 4. You got another 2 to go. Get in an argument like that. But
Yeah,
there
that
would have to be some sort of communal way to know.
right. Yeah, that I do not know. But yes, they definitely had a way to reckon, a 365-day year, because they had annual observances, which, so Easter, for example, I can speak with knowledge about. Um, Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So it partly relies on the phases of the moon, and it partly relies on where we are in relation to the sun with the equinox. So Passover is always the 15th of that month in the Hebrew calendar. And as a colleague of mine who was a rabbi pointed out, all of the festivals happen on the 15th of the month because that's when it's a full moon. That is when it's great to be outside eating and partying in that part of the world. Um, so part of it is pegged to the moon, but part of it is pegged to the movement of the sun. So it'd be after the equinox or so on. So, um, and don't even get me started on the Roman calendar. But the point is, we have here a parallel to the commandment to honor the Sabbath. Is that does that jive?
Yes.
So, Carol, can you share with us, please? We have some selected verses from Deuteronomy 16.
Yes, verse 12.
It should be
Remember,
1 and 2.
oh, okay,
I lost the hyphen there. Sorry.
fine, okay. Observe the month of Abib by keeping the Passover to your Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd at the place that the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. 9 through 10. You shall count 7 weeks. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain. Then you shall keep the festival of weeks to the Lord your God, contributing a free will offering in proportion to the blessing that you have received from the Lord your God. 13 through 17. Shall keep the festival of booths for 7 days, when you have gathered in your produce from the threshing floor and your winepress. Rejoice during your festival, you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female slaves, as well as the Levites, the strangers, the orphans, and the widows resident in your towns. 7 days you shall keep the festival to the Lord your God at the place that the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and all your undertakings, and you shall surely celebrate. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, at the festival of unleavened bread, at the festivals of the weeks, and at the festival of the booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. All shall give as they are able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God that he has given you.
So we have here these festivals and these celebrations, these observances that are not just commanded, but they are handed down from one generation to the next. You are to honor these festivals honor these holidays in the ways your elders teach you to honor them. They are handed down from generation to generation. Does that seem to be parallel to one of the Ten Commandments?
Obey your father and mother.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a parallel here. Honoring your ancestors, honoring the ones who have come before. Because again, part of the way this honors those who have come before, it remembers the Passover. It honors that generation, brings their memory to life, along with celebrating what God has done. So I think we have those first four commandments there. I think you can argue that there's a parallel, and then the next six commandments um, kind of all get tied together here. All the "thou shalt nots." Nick, will you share with us, please, Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 through 20?
You shall appoint judges and officials throughout your tribes in all your towns that the Lord your God has given you, and they shall render just decisions for the people. You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality, and you must not accept bribes, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Justice and only justice you shall pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land your Lord your God is given you.
So all of the commandments 5 through 10, they are all the "thou shalt not." Who do those? What kind of relationships do those laws govern?
The people.
Right. So those are all laws that regulate the relationships between people. And so those, you need judges and officials throughout your tribes to make sure that those commandments are being obeyed and those commandments are being enforced. So um, the commandments about how we relate to God and how we honor generations before us, those, if our theory is correct here, that these chapters are kind of structured in that way, all of the "you will not do this destructive thing to your neighbor," that's kind of summed up in these couple of verses here. Um, you need people to oversee how you interact with each other. Thoughts?
It probably should have these set of verses tied up somewhere in the Cook County court system to about the bribes and that sort of thing.
I don't think it's the courts as much as like the
City Hall,
city council or maybe the state senate or what have you.
right?
Um, but yes, that would be very helpful. Um,
And the
well,
lawmakers,
and of course,
people run for
mhm.
office that's not paying but much, but if they come out millionaires. They're getting bribes under the table.
Yeah, kind of funny how that works. So yeah, there's a lot of these things are surprisingly relevant for how long ago uh, God revealed these things. Excuse me. Let's see. Mark, can you share with us, please, chapter 17, verses 14 through 20?
14 through 20. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose, one of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel.
So, coming back to something we touched on a little bit earlier, the heading in my Bible here says limitations of royal authority. How does that sound to the people Moses spoke this to originally, who are waiting to enter the land?
I would think good.
Sounds good, like some guidance, some guidelines, word of caution, maybe. Because who can regulate what the king does? The only one higher than the king is
God.
God. So here we have God's commandment about how the kings are supposed to act. So yeah, it's kind of a some guardrails there. How does it sound to the people in exile?
There are all these wicked kings all ruling Judah and Israel.
Yeah, it's kind of a commentary on how many of their kings have failed them. Um, he must not acquire many horses or uh, acquire lots of silver and gold just for the sake of that. Um, he must not acquire too many wives. So, the taxation. Um, so, I mean, think of David decided to acquire himself another wife, and he killed her husband to get her. Solomon had his 1,000 wives and concubines. He had unbelievable wealth, and all of those wives brought their gods with them, and Solomon started worshiping the other gods. Then we had Jeroboam and Rehoboam after Solomon, and I don't remember which one of them, but one of them said something along the lines of, "You thought that my father was bad with the way he worked you so hard to gain wealth for him, and the way he taxed you. Well, guess what? And you can look this up in the book of Kings. He says, you thought my father was bad, but my little finger is thicker than my father's, and it says in the Bible, loins. And I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect the word in Hebrew is probably more graphic than that. So, yeah, it's a commentary on the ways that, had your kings not done these things, had they focused more on honoring God and less on enriching themselves, more on honoring God and less about pleasing their 50 wives who each wanted to worship their own gods, you wouldn't be sitting there in Babylon. And it is actually right here in chapter 17 where the Greek title of the book, which gives us our title of the book in English, comes from. In verse 18, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levites. In Greek, when they translated it from Hebrew into Greek, they called copy of the law. They called it to Deuteronomion, the second law. You will have a second law made, and that is where the title of the book comes from. Again,
Nope, we lost you.
uh, the same word, as well as the people have gone through. Anybody? Can anybody hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, we
Sorta.
can hear you now. We missed a bit.
Okay. I was saying that it's, again, we come up to that notion of the way that the same word speaks both to the people who are about to take possession of the land, as well as to the people who have gone through the experience of losing the land. And I think that's a profound thing about the book of Deuteronomy. All right, we have just a little bit further we're going to go tonight, because I am struggling here. So, who was the person who read most recently?
That was me.
That was Mark. Okay. Tom, let's jump back to you. Can you share with us, please, Deuteronomy 22, verses 5 through 12?
A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. If you come on a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, with the mother sitting on the fledglings or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. Let the mother go, taking only the young for yourself, in order that it may go well with you and you may live long. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. Otherwise, you might have blood guilt on your house if anyone shall fall from it. You shall not sow your vineyard with the second kind of seed, or the whole yield will have to be forfeited, both the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard itself. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. You shall not wear clothes made of wool and linen woven together. You shall make tassels on the four corners of the cloak with which you cover yourself. I think I might have put Pastor to sleep. He's frozen. Yeah.
Way to go, Tom.
I sent him a text. Okay, he texted back to me. He says, ask people what the common thread is in verses 5, 9, 10, and 11. Actually, I thought I read 5 through 12. I don't know if he meant just those
Um,
four.
Me okay? All right. Can people hear
Okay.
me now? Oh,
They can hear you. Yeah.
in verses 5, 9, 10, and 11. Okay. What's the common thread there in those four verses?
Well, 9, 10, and 11 are pretty similar, that you're not going to mix things,
Hmm.
like different types of seed. But then when you try to throw 5 in there, it's almost like, I don't know. I'm not grabbing the correlation between 5, 9, 10, and
Hmm.
11.
Well,
It's kind of what.
it is, I
Go ahead.
guess, if you're saying, two different types being woven together is a wrong. Like you could see that in 5 too.
So
Okay. Yeah.
Man should wear man's clothes, women women's clothes. That not the twain shall not meet.
so I think what a lot of this reflects is this notion we see all over the Torah that God God separates things, God divides things, and when God does that, it is for a good and positive purpose. So remember in um, excuse me, remember in Genesis, God doesn't start with nothing. God starts with all the stuff just jumbled up together. God separates the night from the day. God separates the land from the sea. God separates the earth from the sky. Um, and those separations matter to God. Um, so I say, where else do we see this idea? For the Tower of Babel, the people get together and say, let's get together and build a tower up to heaven. And God says, I don't think so. What does it matter if they build a tower up to heaven? What does God have to lose if people build this really tall
Losing you.
Kind of lost your pastor after the Tower of Babel.
okay. So Tower of Babel, why is it a problem that the such a response from God? Is it just because God doesn't like tall buildings?
They were replacing God.
Tell them yeah, the people want to cross that boundary between earth and heaven. The people want to cross a boundary that God has put there. So I think that notion of, God kind of sets things up in a particular way. God is serious about maintaining that. The other thing to throw in there is that a lot of these might be a rejection of practices that the Canaanites practiced. So, for example, there is a good possibility that Canaanite fertility gods, would symbolically change people's gender. God says, if this is a way that you worship another god, don't do it. The Canaanites might have mixed their fields with different kinds of crops. And God says, don't do it. So I think a lot of this has to do with rejecting practices of people who worshiped other gods. Anybody?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So did people hear me say a lot of this has to do with rejecting Canaanite practices?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So if you are unsure how something fits in your Hebrew Bible, and it seems like it's completely coming out of left field, think idolatry. It might have something to do with practices that they used worshiping other gods. That is always a safe bet. Verses 6 and 7. Why would this help things go well with you? That you take just the eggs or just the chicks.
It's caring for the animals, caring for God's creation.
Right? What happens if you eliminate 2 generations of something? Is it going to have a good opportunity to reproduce?
No, it disappear.
Right. So part of it is, you want to allow for the animal to continue to reproduce. Excuse me. Verse 8, building a parapet around the roof of your house. A lot of houses in this part of the world in this time had flat roofs, and that was part of the living space. You would build a wall around on your roof because people would be up there. It says, otherwise you might have blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. It's on you if you don't make things safe. So some of the commandments are very challenging to kind of interpret, and others are really down to earth, common sense type of things. Verse 12 may be a reflection of some kind of royal garb. And now that God's people are created as this royal priesthood, that is open to all the people. You can see a parallel to that in the book of Numbers, where the fringes are a reminder to obey all of God's commandments. Every time you see a fringe on a cloth or on someone's clothes, it's something that's not usually there. So when you see it, it's supposed to remind you God has given us these commandments to follow. We're going to go here to chapter 27, and we are going to call it a night. Carol, will you share with us, please, Deuteronomy 27, 1 through 8?
Then Moses and the elders of Israel charged all the people as follows. Keep the entire commandment that I am commanding you today. On the day that you cross over the Jordan into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones and cover them with plaster. You shall write on them all the words of this law when you have crossed over to enter the land that the Lord God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. So when you have crossed over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones about which I am commanding you today on Mount Ebal, and you shall cover them with plaster. And you shall build an altar there to the Lord your God, an altar of stones on which you have not used an iron tool. You must build the altar of the Lord your God of unhewn stones. Then offer up burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. Make sacrifices of the well-being and eat them there, rejoicing before the Lord your God. You shall write on the stones all the words of this law very clearly.
So, what is the very first thing the people are supposed to do when they cross the river to start taking possession of the land?
Make sure they know what the rules are to live there.
Yeah, the very first thing, set up a place to worship God. And you just don't decide, you know what, I'm going to chop this stone up and we'll build an altar out of it. No, there are there are faithful and unfaithful ways to approach God. And Mark, like you said, not only do we prepare a place to worship, but that place also will have a reminder of how we are to conduct ourselves as God's people. So that matters. Um, the first thing they're going to do when they cross into the promised land is worship. And part of worship is going to be telling the story, reminding people these are the terms of the treaty we agreed to. This is the covenant we have been given. So we're going to stop there because I'm running out of steam tonight, friends. But let me ask: questions, comments, concerns, insights?
I thought it was interesting that he said not just the worship, but you're to write the law in,
Hmm.
after they cross the Jordan. It says, you're going to write on these stones the law.
Yeah, I guess so that it, maybe provides a common point of reference. Anybody who can read, which is maybe not that many people, but anybody who can read can go and see it right there. And even the people who can't read, it will remind them God has given us these commandments. I can't read them off of the stones, but these at least remind me God has said there are ways we can honor him in how we live. Any other thoughts? Well, thank you for bearing with me tonight. We've had some connectivity issues. So thank you for bearing with me on that. Can we conclude our time together praying the Lord's Prayer?
Yes.
Our Father, who
Who
art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Good
Good
luck,
luck.
Nick.
Thank you.
Good luck next week, Nick.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck, Nick.
Yes,
Thank you.
many blessings. We will be praying for you.
Get well, Pastor.
Yes.
Get some
All right.
rest.
Thank you. All right. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.